So far we have covered a lot of ground. We've talked about object literals, we've talked about factory patterns, and this idea of encapsulation. Now, the next step for us to master JavaScript, and in particular understand it more in an object-oriented way. Now, by design, JavaScript is actually object-oriented, and it has something called a prototype chain. Now, you may have heard the term that everything in JavaScript is an object, and I'm going to show you this as we continue and break out some cool examples that will explain things a lot further. Now, before we go any further, let's have a look at the objects that we already have. So here we have our object. It's got items, it's got add, it's got remove, it's got the 3 properties that we've actually used on it. Now, you could consider these as more of the public accessible methods or properties that exist on an object. Now, if I go ahead and expand this, we can in fact see this underscore underscore proto underscore underscore, which then points to an object. So if we go ahead and expand this, we can see some interesting things. We can see another property, which has the constructor. So it's saying the constructor for our object literal was created by JavaScript using this object function. And you can see here that we have this native code. We also have a couple of other properties on our JavaScript objects. Has own property, is a prototype of, and a load more, as well as some setters and some getters. You may have also used something like .toString with your JavaScript objects. So this kind of gives us a peek below the surface of a JavaScript object. And in reality, it doesn't matter if it's one of our objects or JavaScript's built-in object. The prototype is still there. And everything typically does have a prototype unless we explicitly do not want one. So with this in mind, we have our object. So let's go ahead and create a nice console log. What I'm going to do is do object, and we're going to do this .constructor. So if I go ahead and save this out, we then see object and native code. So this is a quick and easy way to see what the constructor is of your particular object. We also have the ability to look at the underscore underscore proto, which I just showed you as well. So let's go underscore underscore proto. Now, this is not an API that you should be using. Proto is actually non-standard. However, all browsers do in fact support it. And it essentially gives us a new object that gives us lots of information about how this particular object was in fact created. So the first will give us the constructor, which then points to the last object, and it could be that we are in fact inheriting. So for example, if we take this, and this comes back to the whole everything in JavaScript is an object. If we look at the constructor and the prototype for an array, what do you think it's going to give us? Is it going to give us an object, or is it going to give us array? This will also tell us a bit more about inheritance itself. So if you did say array, you are in fact correct, because the array type in JavaScript is its own unique type. However, it is still an object. So you can see here that we have this constructor as well on our proto, which tells us that it was from, in fact, an array. Now, the interesting piece, if we expand our constructor, is the constructor itself also has a prototype, which if we go and expand, you can see all of these different methods that we have available on our array. So our array does in fact have prototype methods, which means that we could do something like array.filter. So when we're actually using array.filter like we are in our items, we're in fact inheriting from the array prototype, and you can see that we have this filter way down in our object. Now this comes in handy when learning about object-oriented programming in JavaScript, because the way that we can share properties, data, methods, and behavior is through the prototype chain. Alternatively, with a functional programming approach, we can then compose functions to create new objects. This, however, is the object-oriented method of using prototypes and understanding them in JavaScript. Now, what's also interesting, if we close our prototype, you can see that we have a few things here. We have from is array. So these are known as static methods. We don't need to create a new instance of an array to access these. We could, in fact, say array.from, and we could then pass in something to our array.from. We don't have to boot up a new array literal like this. Now, interestingly, with both of these, we also have the ability to look at this instance of. So here if we say our object is an instance of object, similarly what we'll do is copy this and add it down below for our array. Now what we're going to do is change this to an array first. We'll save this out. We can then see true on line 5, so we know that our instance of an object is correct. So under the hood, behind the scenes, JavaScript is in fact, when we create a new object literal, it's doing something like new object under the scenes. And we know this because it's an instance of, and we only have instances when we use the new keyword, which we'll come on to momentarily. Now the interesting piece is we have this instance of array. So it does in fact tell us that this is an array. We then see the value true logged out in the console. Now if we go ahead and change this to object, we're also going to see the value of true. So an array is simply a type of object. So the array type is in fact inheriting from the object because we can do things such as array.toString. And the array prototype doesn't contain that, it inherits it from the object. So there's a couple of layers to give you a final representation of your object. So this answers the question for us, what is a prototype? We can look at the prototype of any object, whether it's a custom one or a built-in, and all of them will also have this __ proto. Again, I'm just going to say that you don't really want to use this in production, but it gives you an opportunity to examine your objects in a bit more detail. Similarly, with strings, functions, we all have these different types where we can have visibility of what each JavaScript type is in fact inheriting. And this is a really good way to in fact learn JavaScript, is to just look at the prototypes of new objects and say, oh, let's pick one. Maybe we'll have a look at copy within, for example, or perhaps array.entries. We've also got some new additions such as flat map. So these are a great way to, one, keep up to date, but also look at JavaScript itself. Now, as I mentioned in object-oriented programming with JavaScript, understanding this is absolutely key. So in this video, we've just done a quick dive into what is a prototype. A prototype is simply a property on the object or on an object. It could be an array object. It could be a custom object like we've seen down here. Some of these objects will be constructed underneath with the new keyword, which allows us to then check whether something is an instance of. And in the next video, what I want to do is then show you how to create our own custom prototype version of this object. But for now, we've got the constructor, we've got the proto. Some of our JavaScript types allow us to peek and get a nice safety check with them using instance of object. However, we've learned that this instance of array actually gives us a false reading when we do something like this and we change it across to instance of object. Now for this use case, it might be beneficial to do something like this, where we can say array.isArray, and this is a static new method or reasonably new method, which will then give us a nice true false reading. So over on line 10, we can see that we have a nice true. Above we have true and true because an array is an instance of an array, and it's also an instance of an object because instance of is taking into consideration the prototype chain. So whenever you're checking something using an instance of, what you're actually doing is saying, does this object here, or whatever I'm using to compare against, live somewhere on the prototype of this object? So it's kind of backwards in a way you think of it, or you could say this object, does it have an object on its prototype? And that's what instance of is for. And you can see how this can lead to some nasty bugs if you were to be checking if things are an array when you in fact meant an object. So again, just to sum up, we've looked at constructors, prototypes. We've uncovered the idea that when we are constructing custom JavaScript objects, we're going to be leaning on this prototype property somewhat. So that's the built-in what is a prototype. Now what we're going to do is convert this over to our own custom constructor function. We're going to show you the old way, and then we'll dive into some new class-based syntax, as well as some really nice modern features that are now available to us in JavaScript. So that's it for this video. We understand prototypes. Let's go ahead and dive into the next lesson, where we'll take this one step further and create our own cart constructor function.